This is a true story that happened in South Korea. A few children suddenly rushed out from a roadside snack shop, shouting that the shop owner had gone mad. A neighbor, an older brother figure, went into the shop to check. Unexpectedly, when the children's mother turned around, her face was filled with panic. Her husband was lying on the ground, barely breathing. The neighbor saw the woman holding a blood-dripping knife in her hand and was utterly shocked. The couple, who usually seemed to have a good relationship, had now turned to such violence. Little did they know, it was mental instability caused by taking birth control pills. She was taken to the police station just like that. She hoped her friend, who was a lawyer, could help her, arguing that she hadn't stabbed her husband intentionally, but was possessed by something. But the lawyer was very practical and ungrateful. The woman recalled how, back then, she had no money to pay her tuition fees and had lent the lawyer all the money she had saved from working in a sock factory. At that time, the lawyer was so moved by the bundle of coins that she cried her heart out. Now, just 10 years later, she had completely forgotten everything. The woman was utterly devastated. On the other side, in a pharmacy, a salesperson was still enthusiastically promoting this drug, which could cause hallucinations in some women. She told the male customer in front of her that this celebrity-endorsed product was effective and popular. What puzzled her was that the man actually took the pill on the spot and even asked if he could take 2 in a day. It turned out this man was none other than the communal lawyer, Pak. The reason he took the medication was to collect evidence. The client was a former employee of the pharmaceutical company, fired for reporting the drug's side effects. Pak found it strange that after taking the medication for half a day, there were no so-called hallucinogenic effects. Fortunately, his secretary reminded him that he was a man. At this moment, the ungrateful woman rushed over. It turned out she was the legal representative of the problematic pharmaceutical company, bringing an offer of 25 million won to settle with the client. Pak noticed her expensive watch and bluntly remarked that capital was a powerful thing in Korea. The health of countless women, just one watch, and they thought they could bury the issue. This woman herself was a leading figure in the Korean legal world, with a 92% win rate over many years, a reputation well earned. Taking her to court would obviously be a tough battle, but it was clear she had violated the ethical principles of her profession as a lawyer. Before leaving, Pak unexpectedly performed a neck adjustment for her. She didn't grasp that the male lead was implying she should reform her ways. Instead, she simply found the twist quite relieving. On the court date, Pak failed to obtain evidence regarding the drug's side effects. He could only argue for labor compensation on the grounds of the employee's unfair dismissal. Little did he know, the female lawyer dropped a bombshell. She had already investigated the relationship between the company representative and the female employee. The judge also confirmed this directly from the client. The female lawyer seized this leverage, arguing that the lawsuit was a revenge act triggered by the representative breaking up with the female employee. While this revelation shattered the representative's family relationships, she asserted that moral issues alone would not justify financial losses. The client was truly unfortunate. Despite having seen the drug side effects test report on the representative's computer, she couldn't provide any evidence. Not only did she lose the case, but she also ruined her own reputation. This blow was precisely delivered by the pharmaceutical company representative, blaming her for exposing his private life in court. The female lawyer, however, believed that buying a designer bag to appease his wife was more cost-effective than losing the case and paying compensation. This display of her cunning once again impressed the superior present. Upon returning to the law firm, the chairman proposed making her a partner. Now, to clarify the relationships, the 3 elderly men were brothers. The second brother was the head of the law firm, the third was the pharmaceutical company representative, and they all belonged to the same conglomerate. The group chairman was their eldest brother. As for the female lawyer, she was originally the housekeeper for the eldest brother's family. The pharmaceutical company representative believed she wasn't qualified to become a partner. However, the elder chairman had long regarded her as a granddaughter, even stating he intended to transfer some shares to her. But this was obviously unfair. Thus, her superior assigned her a task. The document in question was the report on the side effects of the contraceptive pill. It revealed at least 5 victims who had suffered severe hallucinations. Her mission was to settle all these issues before investigators could gather concrete evidence. If she succeeded, the partnership would be hers. When the superior presented the list of victims, Lee was stunned. One of them was none other than the old acquaintance her superior had sought her help with. The superior issued an ultimatum: find evidence proving this woman already had a history of mental illness. Clearly, Lee already had a plan forming in her mind. The next day, she went to the investigation center to meet the woman. The woman could never have imagined that the friend before her would betray her so deeply. All her hopes were instantly shattered. At around 4 a.m., the investigation center notified her. By the time she arrived at the law firm for work, the pharmaceutical company representative was already applauding her achievements. This outcome perfectly demonstrated that the woman had pre-existing mental illness and that it had nothing to do with the medication. Both representatives fulfilled their promises, organizing a lavish promotion ceremony for her. Just as she stood on stage to deliver her speech, the FBI stormed in, arresting her on charges of inciting someone to take their own life. Unexpectedly, the plot took a dramatic turn. A day earlier, Lee had approached her close friend, urging her to stage a drastic act. The purpose was to escalate the situation, so that once the media reported it, the FBI would inevitably conduct a deeper investigation. Through medical tests, it would be proven that the friend's mental instability was caused by the defective contraceptive pills. This would absolve her of responsibility for stabbing her husband and even entitle her to compensation from the pharmaceutical company. That evening, Lee met with the communal lawyer Pak. She handed him the internal drug testing report from the pharmaceutical company, asking him to take her place as her friend's defense lawyer. Only by doing so could they force the company to stop selling the defective contraceptive pills. When she saw her best friend lying in the hospital again, Lee felt an indescribable ache in her heart. What was meant to be a mere act turned into an unexpectedly intense performance. Her friend then revealed her struggles, showing that she was still as kind as she had been in the past. Lee realized her friend's sacrifices were worth it. Stopping the sale of the defective drug would save countless women. Lee, however, was taken to the investigation center as a result. Fortunately, Pak understood her good intentions and bailed her out. But now, Lee needed to figure out one thing: had someone within the company reported her? From the police, Lee learned that it was her superior who made the call. She knew it was all over for her. That night, it would be her last time staying in the luxurious apartment at the law firm, and her last time driving her beloved luxury car to work. But she knew she had to take responsibility for her actions. She went directly in front of the representative and kneeled down. However, her superior was already furious. She was the ungrateful wolf who could never be satisfied. To help her friend, she had stabbed the firm in the back. At the board meeting, all the executives unanimously agreed to suspend her for 1 year. Fortunately, the chairman pitied her and sent Lee to work at the community lawyer's office in the county town. There were no high-rise buildings here. She told the housing agent she had a fear of heights, and they helped her find a top-floor apartment. Without her luxury car, she had to take the bus to work. What she never expected was that the place she was assigned to work was the same community lawyer's office where Pak was. Although she wasn't used to the office's humble environment, she had to persevere for the chairman's sake. But working overtime every night was becoming too much to handle. Just as a torrential downpour began, she thought Pak, whom she'd encountered multiple times, would hold an umbrella for her. However, the resentful man remained indifferent, showing no sign of compassion. Just when she was at a loss, a luxury car drove through the pouring rain. It was the pharmaceutical company representative from the group. She ended up getting into the old man's car. Fortunately, Pak had been watching everything closely. Lee, along with her best friend, had caused the company to suffer losses. The old man had never had good intentions. Sure enough, his hands finally reached out to her. Lee instantly felt uncomfortable all over. Despite the woman's repeated warnings, the old man ignored them. Furious, she charged straight at his white-haired head, colliding with it. At that moment, a large off-road vehicle suddenly appeared, its powerful braking almost knocking the old man's nose off. The man who stepped out grabbed the old man by the collar and tossed him into the pouring rain. He had intended to give him a black eye, but the woman stopped him. It turned out the old man was her former boss, someone she couldn't afford to offend. The handsome man, Pak, was obedient and respected her wishes. Together, they left the scene. After sending the woman home, Pak left without even asking for her phone number. They already knew each other. After all, as they worked in the same community lawyer's office, Suddenly, Lee received a call from her former superior. The old white-haired man had passed away, and the manner of his death was very strange. Shocked, Lee immediately suspected Pak to be the killer. She rushed out, hoping to find him and get some answers. But instead, she saw investigators preparing to take him away. Before Lee could speak, Pak calmly told the investigators to bring evidence before making any accusations. At the investigation center, the investigators listed countless motives for Pak allegedly killing the old man. Each theory was confirmed by Pak with a nod. However, there was no evidence to support any of these claims. With that, Pak walked out of the investigation center with confidence. The cause of the old man's death became increasingly mysterious. His last phone call was made to Lee, which made her a suspect as well. Yet, once again, the investigation had no concrete evidence to support any of these suspicions. It's just as well that the old man died. Both of them fully devoted themselves to their work, but taking on a pro bono defense for this mother and son made their heads spin. Pak wanted to give Lee an opportunity to shine, but during her professional questioning, only the mother responded. Meanwhile, the client, a chubby boy, was busy stuffing himself with food. She couldn't tolerate it anymore. It turned out that the boy's intelligence level was that of a 6-year-old. Faced with the mother's apologies, she finally understood the difficulties of being a pro bono lawyer. These were things that Pak had long grown accustomed to, but for Lee, who always prioritized money, it was unbearable. She didn't want to stay in such a place where it didn't feel like living and where she didn't get paid for her work. So, she called a journalist friend. She planned to use the story of this mother and son to promote herself. This way, she could pass the boss's assessment and return to her high-paying position. After learning that the chubby boy had stabbed someone to death over a stolen cake, and that the other party had promised in front of the elderly man to plead not guilty due to the boy's intellectual disability, Lee decided to handle the case. On the day of the trial, she bought decent clothes for the boy, which moved his mother deeply. Little did they know, Lee's real intention was to make the boy look better in photographs and interviews with reporters. She also bought the boy a bag of chips and told him that if anyone tried to take them, he must react as crazily as he did the first time they met. She hoped the boy's abnormal behavior would catch the judge's attention. However, his actions during the trial left Lee completely hopeless. Although the chubby boy had a low IQ, he was very grateful. Since his older sister treated him well, he naturally wouldn't act as crazily as he did the first time they met. Lee's plan to return to her high-paying position fell apart. The boy was convicted of manslaughter and sentenced to 1.5 years in prison. When Pak learned that Lee had tried to use the pitiful mother and son to promote herself, he likened her to a worm drowning in Korean won. He believed that if all public attorneys in Korea were like her, people living at the bottom of society would never receive fair treatment. Although Lee outwardly argued with Pak, using a pile of high-sounding principles to refute him, she was gradually influenced by his kindness. In the end, she decided to defend the chubby boy again. This mother and son had long relied on subsidies to get by, living a very frugal life. The elderly man had injured his foot while collecting scrap. The mother handed over a crumpled envelope, saying that her son's pocket money inside might have been stolen. Before Lee left, the elderly woman gave her a special gift. It wasn't until she walked out the door that she opened it to look inside. Although she scorned the few pieces of fruit and a pack of spicy snacks, it was undoubtedly the most valuable gift this family could offer. When she saw the chubby boy again, she realized this young man had no ability to take care of himself. He saw Lee as a mother-like figure and proudly wanted to show her that he had already put on his diaper. What was even stranger was that the chubby boy had spent his pocket money to buy a watch. Although he couldn't tell time, he used it to count the days until he could see his mother again. This deeply moved Lee. A few days later, one of the boy's relatives brought her a kite, saying that the boy had prepared it for her a long time ago, but hadn't given it to her because of the court defeat. As she watched the kite soaring freely in the sky, she was reminded of her own childhood. For the boy, whose mental age was only 6, his idea of freedom was simply being by his mother's side. At that moment, the kite suddenly got stuck on a power line. Lee grabbed a broom and was about to poke it down. In her boldness, she even dared to jump up and jab at it. This leap should have ended with her falling alongside the broom, but thankfully, a handsome guy arrived just in time and pulled her back. However, her large head accidentally crashed into the man's nose, knocking him into a daze and causing his eyes to roll back. She called out to him as handsome guy for a long while until he slowly opened his eyes, but he suddenly claimed to have lost his memory. It turned out to be fake. Lee, now furious, completely forgot that he had saved her twice. Seeing the nosebleed dripping from him, she didn't offer a word of thanks. Instead, she accused him of stalking her for a long time. Little did she know, a case involving an abandoned baby, handed over by a colleague, piqued her interest. Having grown up in an orphanage herself, Lee felt a deep connection. When she saw the pitiful client, however, she didn't feel sympathy. Instead, she angrily scolded the woman, saying she didn't deserve to be called a person. But the woman shared the hardships behind her actions. She revealed that she, too, was an orphan and had been heartlessly abandoned by her boyfriend after getting pregnant. She gave birth at an unwed mother's shelter, and later, forced by circumstances and a new boyfriend, she made the painful decision to abandon her child. Though her actions didn't deserve sympathy, Lee, as a fellow woman, couldn't help but feel reluctant to further criticize her. No matter how much she defended her, jail time was unavoidable in South Korea. Abandoning a baby is considered a very serious crime. Lee originally planned for the woman to work at a bakery upon release. Unexpectedly, the woman announced that she was pregnant again. Although Lee was left speechless, she understood that abortion is not permitted in South Korea. The woman promised to raise this child properly, but Lee reminded her that even the previous child hadn't been registered yet. For the first time, the money-minded Lee personally helped name and register the abandoned child. She even found a loving adoptive family for the baby, spending all her time helping people at the bottom of society without earning any money. Lee was desperate to return to a high-paying job. She hoped her journalist friend could report on her good deeds, but the friend dismissed the idea, saying such stories lacked appeal. In South Korea, even the story of a chaebol family's dog would get more attention. This was the harsh reality of the country. Chaebol hares were notoriously arrogant and tyrannical, often indulging in perverse hobbies that didn't even spare children. What they didn't expect was that one child had secured a particularly dedicated pro bono lawyer. Pak. Arriving just in time, Pak caught the chaebol hare in the act of his disgusting behavior. Enraged, Pak kicked off the rearview mirror of his car. Before the hare could react, Pak stormed in and threw the broken mirror right in front of him. He couldn't believe the child could afford a lawyer. Pak, without hesitation, used a sandbag and his powerful fists to explain things to him. Both of them were taken to the police station, accused of mutual assault. Once again, Lee became Pak's lawyer. She had been worried about Pak getting hurt, but it turned out that the weak chaebol hare was no match for Pak. After getting beaten to a pulp, the chaebol hare willingly agreed to a settlement. Since Pak had physically assaulted the client, he was no longer able to defend the child's mother, so he had no choice but to ask Lee to take over. She hadn't wanted to continue doing this thankless pro bono defense, but the next day, Pak brought the mother and child to the office. When Lee saw that the child's mother was deaf and mute, she again thought of using them to promote herself. So she privately approached Pak and asked him what exactly had happened between the mother, child, and the chaebol hare. Together, they decided to work hand in hand to help the poor mother and child. The child, still in middle school, was so thoughtful it made people's hearts atch. He didn't hold a grudge against the chaebol hare's bullying. All he cared about was preventing his mother from going to prison. This lawyer named Lee became their only lifeline. In court, the mother was charged with the crime of theft by the prosecutor. Lee had to prove that her actions at the chaebol hare's house did not qualify as theft, so the law of theft would not apply to her. After hearing Lee explain the mother and child's hardships, the prosecutor believed she was exploiting the advantage of being a vulnerable group to gain the judge's sympathy. This led to a back-and-forth argument between the prosecution and defense. The battle continued into the evening. By the time the jury members had all left, the prosecutor was dry-mouthed, and the judge was so tired he had fallen asleep. When the judge was woken up, he could no longer tolerate the prosecutor's rigid stance. Sending people from the lower class, struggling to survive, to prison wouldn't bring much in terms of performance rewards. The prosecutor finally amended the indictment, and as a result, the mother was spared prison time. She only had to pay a fine of 200,000 Korean won. Lee, working overtime to provide free legal defense for people from the lower class, had shown a noticeable change, which Pak noticed. She was no longer the lawyer who always focused on money. To celebrate their success, the two decided to go for a drink. On the other hand, the chaebol here had a rough time. The young master, unable to deal with even a nanny, was about to strike the son of the scrap collector once again. But this time, the elderly man stopped himself. He decided to salvage his reputation and give the two low-paid public attorneys a small lesson. What no one expected was that, as the elderly man enjoyed himself, his delicate hands suddenly turned rough and strong. Before the old man could react, it was too late. A man, whose build resembled Pak's, dragged the old man all the way to the lake at his mansion. It seemed that he was going to make the old man taste the flavor of his own drainage system. Once the old man was pushed into the water, he couldn't get back up again. Strangely, Lee, who had been drinking with Pak, was already passed out drunk. When she woke up the next morning, she suddenly realized she was in Pak's house. What exactly happened the night before? Could it be that after she got drunk, Pak took her to his room and quietly disposed of the elderly man? Though everything remained a mystery, Pak had already caught the attention of a new female investigator. Lee even suspected that Pak might be the boss, since his persona of killing the rich to help the poor fit the narrative. However, the plot took another turn. The man who ran the snack shop was also under suspicion. The tape placed deliberately on the table, blocking the view, was exactly the same as the one used to bind the elderly man. Even more bizarre, Pak helped the snack shop owner deliver a pizza, and the destination happened to be the orphanage. However, the orphanage director was just as despicable as the others, and even Pak's gaze toward him wasn't calm. That evening, Lee arrived at the orphanage, bringing a birthday gift for her best friend's son. She had planned to visit the child, but the old director claimed the boy had already fallen asleep. As Lee was about to leave, the old man disgustingly grabbed her hand. Although she had grown up in the orphanage, she felt no affection for the director because he was an evil old man. He was destined not to survive the night. Soon, he was dragged to the seaside and met the same fate as the two elderly men before him. Things were becoming increasingly bizarre. Who could possibly hate the corrupt chaebols in South Korea this much? This was undoubtedly the pinnacle of a 2022 mystery drama. In just a few months, several top-tier billionaires in South Korea had mysteriously died, and all of their deaths were related to water. Some were found by the sea, others near the full drains of their own villas. The first victim, the pharmaceutical tycoon, suffered an even worse fate. He was found kneeling in his bathtub, dying in despair. This serial murder case, heavily covered by the media, caught the attention of South Korea's high-ranking officials. Soon, they dispatched a top female investigator to handle the case. Never judge a book by its cover. Because this drama didn't use any beauty filters, all the victims were from the same age group of wealthy individuals. It was clear that the killer was an extreme anti-wealth activist. If they could just figure out the cause of the first elderly man's death, the case could be closed. However, the intelligence of the South Korean police was generally quite low, and the female investigator had never respected them. She went alone to the victim's villa to gather information, which was the very place the first elderly man was murdered. There were no signs of forced entry, indicating that the victim had willingly opened the door for the killer. From this, it was deduced that the killer must have been someone familiar to the victim. The elderly man was simply meeting a university student every weekend, but this time, due to the woman's personal circumstances, she arrived late the next morning and was the one who found the body and called the police. With the suspicion of the female university student eliminated, it was clear that the killer must have been someone who knew the elderly man's habits. However, everyone close to the elderly man had been investigated, and they all had alibis. There was only one possibility left. The elderly man had been followed. Fortunately, his company was surrounded by CCTV cameras. After reviewing multiple surveillance footage clips, a suspicious vehicle was spotted. It was Pak's car, and it had been tracking the elderly man for a month. But this woman, who was not an ordinary South Korean police officer, didn't arrest him based solely on this clue. Instead, she tracked down a woman who had previously had a lawsuit with the elderly man. The word, actively, confirmed the female investigator's suspicions. Since they had interacted before, it wasn't impossible that the elderly man had voluntarily opened the door for Pak. However, there was still a lack of direct evidence. Just then, the female investigator received a phone call from her colleague. Another elderly man had been found dead by the sea, and the victim was none other than the director of the orphanage. He was the third wealthy elderly man to die in the same manner, with the same tragic fate. This sparked the female investigator's interest in solving the case even more. She rushed to the place where the elderly man had worked before. To her surprise, she discovered that several of the victims had interacted with each other while they were still alive. She just needed to figure out one thing: whether Pak had any connection with the deceased director. After receiving a confirmation, Pak was now officially linked to the third elderly man's death. So what about the second elderly man, the one who was found lying in the filthy drain? The female investigator immediately called in the second old man's son to gather more information. The audience already knew that this rich heir had a past conflict with Pak. Under the intense questioning from the investigator, the heir admitted that the injuries on his face were caused by Pak. Sure enough, this tied him to Pak once again. Now, the investigator needed to understand his motive for the crime. It turned out that this man was Pak's colleague Lee. Could it be that the first deceased elderly man had mistreated Lee in life, and Pak killed him out of revenge? But it was clear that Pak and Lee had only been ordinary colleagues, so there was no obvious motive for Pak to kill the old man. However, when the investigator presented evidence that Pak had been stalking the victim, Lee was left in utter shock. As colleagues at the same public service law office, they worked together every day and even lived in the same building. Almost every time a crime occurred, Lee found himself unable to provide an alibi to prove he wasn't at the scene. He couldn't believe that this kind-hearted public service lawyer could be the one responsible for killing multiple wealthy old men. Pak's usual image was friendly and generous, but he specifically targeted arrogant, domineering people. The old man, who thought that owning a luxury car made the road his personal domain, encountered Pak, who was determined to challenge him. Though the old man's car was expensive, his driving skills were no match for Pak's. Pak repeatedly swerved in front of the old man's car, scaring him into trembling with fear. After showing off his driving skills, Pak drove off without a second thought. The old man cursed, lamenting how he had never encountered someone so audacious. Little did he know, he was actually the head of the investigation office, a man who was not only despicable, but had also done many inhumane things in the past. The young girl, fresh out of police academy, wanted to become a police officer, but her journey took an unexpected turn. The chief of police invited her to a KTV for an interview, and in order to secure the job, she reluctantly entered the world of neon lights and alcohol. However, after drinking, the chief's intentions were far from professional. At that moment, the girl saw the true nature of the chief, but it was already too late. She was assaulted by him, and the experience left her devastated. 8 years later, her mother managed to find her a pro bono lawyer, because after losing the lawsuit, her daughter had been sent to a mental institution. The family had drained all their savings on her care. Upon hearing the client's story, Lee was curious about which lawyer had defended the chief back then. It was then that Lee discovered that the lawyer responsible for that case was none other than herself, from the very law firm where she had worked for 10 years. Shocked and disturbed, she immediately contacted her former colleagues to retrieve the case files. To her surprise, the case she had worked on years ago was the same one that had caused so much suffering. Lee couldn't help but recall the days when she had colluded with her superior. Driven by the high fees for the defense, she had blindly believed the police chief's side of the story. Now, working at a pro bono law firm, she finally began to understand the significance of what Pak had told her. Her legal knowledge had become a weapon used to protect the wealthy, and the guilt of her past actions weighed heavily on her. She felt that she owed the victims an apology, especially the woman whose life had been shattered by the actions of the corrupt police chief. The girl who had once dreamed of becoming a police officer had completely transformed. Lee admitted that she had been the one to defend the chief back then, which only caused more harm to the woman who had already suffered from the trauma. The victim, now mentally unstable, could hardly believe that someone who had lost their moral compass could ever stand up for her or seek justice. And in the end, the police chief remained untouchable. His power had only grown stronger over the years, making any hope of justice feel even more distant. Lee secretly returned to the company where she used to work. She wanted to get the litigation materials from that year to trip up the director, but the statute of limitations in Korean law was about to expire. However, It wasn't a big problem because a chilling wind had already blown toward the director's villa. The old man heard the doorbell and hurried to open the door to check. It turned out to be an acquaintance. Before he could react, he was directly dragged to his own bathroom and successfully enjoyed the same treatment first three old men, but his life was not meant to end the next morning. This morning, when the female investigator arrived at the scene, the fat man said the neighbors had discovered him last night after timely medical attention. He was still breathing. No useful evidence was left at the scene. The fat man firmly asserted that the killer was Pak. The female investigator had already suspected, but struggled to find direct evidence. The fat man believed Pak's motive for committing the crime was to become a modern-day savior. Choosing to become a public defender was also to punish the strong and support the weak. This explanation was obviously not accepted by the female investigator. She decided to meet this extremely mysterious man. Not only was he well versed in the law, but his IQ was as high as 139. Without direct evidence, the female investigator could only politely hope he would cooperate to unravel the mysteries behind a few murders. Pak, of course, had such an obligation, but the female investigator had already made her own calculations. As soon as Pak threw his empty coffee cup into the trash can, the woman immediately and secretly picked it up. Her goal was to obtain his DNA. The staff, after several days of comparison, successfully matched Pak's DNA at the scene of the second victim. Finally, there was enough reason to arrest Pak. The fat man had long been annoyed by this lawyer's arrogance, and when he personally escorted him away, he looked very pleased with himself. Lee still couldn't believe that Pak was the murderer. She rushed to the female investigator to clarify the situation, but was scolded by the woman, who told her to prepare for an investigation herself. The battle of wits between the two high-intelligence individuals had begun. The female investigator presented the first piece of evidence. Why was Pak driving and stalking the first victim? Although stalking is illegal, as a lawyer, it is essential to know both the enemy and oneself in order to win a case. This reasoning made sense and could barely prove that Pak wasn't involved in the first victim's death. But what about the second victim? Why did Pak actively participate in his son's case? Was it simply because the person involved was disabled and Pak just happened to know sign language? Then why did he assault the second victim's son, the rich heir? It's a strange coincidence that Pak had connections with the second victim as well. How should the DNA found at the scene be explained? Pak clearly couldn't explain himself. At this moment, Lee arrived at the investigation office and requested to see the female investigator. She presented the payment record from that night at the barbecue restaurant. Although she had been heavily drunk, the time of the transaction and the restaurant's surveillance footage couldn't be fabricated. This evidence could completely prove that Pak had an alibi during time of the crime. With this, the DNA found at the scene became a mystery. The female investigator, however, was not ready to give up. The recently hospitalized and unconscious police chief was also connected to Pak. When asked why he had tampered with the chief's car a few days ago, Pak replied that he didn't know the man was a police chief. He just couldn't stand his road bully behavior. All of Pak's answers were flawless, and the suspicion against him was completely cleared. The fat guy was, of course, the typical Korean police officer, believing that Pak had been making clever arguments to evade suspicion. This left the female investigator speechless. The reason upper management had sent her to investigate was precisely because they were aware of the incompetence of these subordinates. Just then, a colleague rushed in to inform them that the arrest warrant had been rejected by the prosecutor's office. This left all the investigators feeling defeated. When Pak was released, Lee, who had been sitting on a chair, had already fallen into a deep sleep. As they walked out of the investigation office, the sky had already begun to brighten. Lee couldn't help but feel puzzled about this ever-mysterious man and couldn't resist asking him, "So what about the DNA found at the scene?" Pak, known for his humor, was always good at playing such games. The audience knows that Pak helped out at his brother's dumpling shop, where he accidentally discovered some tape and casually moved it to another location. This means that Pak's brother has become the biggest boss of this drama. Before the truth comes to light, there is still one old man who is bound to die, Lee's grandfather, the wealthy tycoon who raised her. This is a suspenseful Korean drama that never follows the usual formula. When the son returns home and sees his father tied to a chair with dark, burnt feet still connected to an electric wire, anyone would naturally call the police. However, when the butler pulls out his phone to make the call, the man immediately stops him. The reason? His father should not die in such a disgraceful manner, and he asks the butler to help clean up the scene. This man is running for a seat in the National Assembly, and in his youth, the old man committed many heinous acts. To protect his own future, he cleaned up his father's body, carefully arranging it on the bed to create the illusion of a natural death. However, the butler had already made a call to the police. If the butler dares to tell the truth to the officers, the man threatens to harm his family. When the investigation team arrives, they don't find any obvious signs of foul play on the body. However, the butler's hesitant words and uneasy hands raise suspicions among the officers. They immediately notify their colleagues in the investigation department to come to assist and instruct the politician and the butler to leave the crime scene. At this moment, the old man's private doctor arrives, and the officers belatedly realize that having a private doctor means this family is no ordinary one. The man immediately declares his identity as a politician. Faced with the power and authority, the officers can only bow an apology, regretting not believing the politician's words earlier. The private doctor then issues a death certificate stating natural causes. The deceased old man had been a guardian to the female lead in the story, and upon hearing of his death, Lee finds it hard to accept. After all, after her biological grandmother passed away, the old man had become the person who loved her most. However, what she doesn't know is that her grandmother was killed by the very old man who had raised her. When she arrives at the old man's residence, several investigators suddenly appear at the scene. The politician feels uneasy. It turns out that while the mortuary staff was preparing the old man's body, they discovered the charred black toes. The death certificate clearly stated natural causes, so they chose to report it to the police. The investigation team's renewed involvement undoubtedly made the politician anxious. They had to bribe people at the investigation office to return. Lee, who had gone to attend her grandfather's funeral, was sent back to the office. However, just as she returned to work, she received a call from an employee at the bakery. This man had once been helped by Lee. He said he felt like he had been set up and asked Lee to defend him. Before he could finish speaking, another man hung up the phone. This person was the scapegoat hired by the politician using money. Once locked up, he realized the seriousness of the situation. It was already too late to back out because someone bought off at the investigation office was about to silence him. Soon, the politician announced to the media that the person who killed his father had already died in the investigation office. When Lee saw the politician's statement, she couldn't believe that the cowardly man had the guts to approach the politician. She wanted to get to the bottom of it. This explanation seemed almost reasonable. The old man knew that the bakery worker had called Lee before he died, and after repeatedly confirming the content of the call, he finally let out a sigh of relief. What made Lee feel lost was that she had lost the only person in the world who truly cared about her. However, Pak's constant, meticulous care hadn't gone unnoticed by anyone, and he always appeared when Lee needed him most. How could Lee not be moved by a man who had saved her life multiple times? Yet, she never imagined that her grandfather's death would still be linked to Pak. It was past 2 a.m. when Pak, with light steps, slowly walked into the investigation office. The duty officer thought he had lost his mind, and the serious crimes team rushed to the scene in a panic. The female investigator was just about to verify his identity when she turned around and saw Pak's familiar face. She was stunned. Wasn't Pak already cleared of suspicion? His purpose was simple: to stop the politician from winning the election. Upon learning that someone was voluntarily going to the investigation office to report, the politician completely broke down. With the election day fast approaching, once the serious crimes team got involved in the investigation, all of his father's crimes from years ago would be exposed. Furthermore, the Korean media was extremely competitive, and the news of the serial killer's confession quickly surged to the top of the trending topics. Under pressure, the female investigator had to speed up the case review. However, when she asked Pak about his motive, he wouldn't even open his mouth. He wanted the investigator to figure it out on her own. This left the politician helpless. Pak was clearly seeking revenge, convinced that his father had a deep, personal grudge against him. Meanwhile, Pak, seeing no action from the investigators, decided to change his strategy. He hoped to get a lawyer for himself and specifically requested Lee to defend him. If Lee found out that the man she loved had killed her grandfather, She would surely do everything in her power to uncover the truth. Still at work, Lee received a call from the female investigator. The serial killer wanted to hire her as a lawyer to defend him for killing her grandfather. This was undoubtedly a torment for Lee, but she wanted to see what the heartless murderer looked like. When the man was brought in by the staff, Lee turned around and saw that the one wearing the handcuffs was her own boyfriend. At that moment, Lee was completely devastated, unable to believe that the man who had once guided her toward goodness had taken her grandfather's life. Her chest ached severely, and when she lay down, she couldn't get up. However, she knew she couldn't stay in despair forever. She had to pull herself together to seek justice for her grandfather's death. At the investigation office, Lee accompanied the interrogation as the suspect's lawyer. Pak confessed that he had connected high-voltage electricity to the old man's toes, turned on the electric switch, and then subjected him to waterboarding. The brutal method of execution made Lee grit her teeth, helpless but filled with anger. When the female investigator asked Pak about his motive for the crime, he simply said the old man deserved to die. In order to find evidence of Pak's involvement in the crime, the female investigator led a team to the scene where the old man had been murdered. However, the place had already been thoroughly cleaned, and the investigation hit a dead end. Lee was determined to make Pak pay for her grandfather's death. She would use all her knowledge to ensure that the judge sentenced him to death. To understand her boyfriend's true motive for killing her grandfather, she first went to Pak's landlord's house. Having lost contact with Pak, the elderly man was already in tears. Lee wanted to confess what had happened, but she hesitated, unwilling to break the news to the elderly man. She hoped to find some clues about Pak's identity from him. Lee learned that Pak's grandmother suffered from severe memory loss, and that Pak was the closest person to her in the world. Additionally, Pak had a younger cousin who was in first grade, but had not returned home since school had finished. Lee then found Pak's college friend, who, although close to him, knew very little about Pak's family. He only knew that Pak's father had worked at a shoe factory. Lee immediately went to the shoe factory where Pak's father had worked, hoping to find more information. The man there confirmed that Pak's colleague, who had the same surname, had died in the United States. However, when Lee mentioned that the son of this man had returned to Korea, the old man couldn't help but laugh mockingly. Lee learned that the son of Pak's colleague had tragically passed away in first grade, which was why Pak's family had moved to the United States. This revelation led Lee to suddenly realize that the Pak she knew now had taken on a new identity, using his father's name to seek revenge. The deep enmity between Pak's father and her grandfather was slowly starting to come into focus. To uncover the full truth, Lee decided to visit Pak's brother's dumpling shop again, but as before, there was no one there. Previously, Pak had often brought Lee here to eat dumplings, so this time, Lee decided to climb through the window. After rummaging around for 3 hours, her eyes caught a few rolls of green tape, which seemed to be a significant clue. When Lee entered the storage room, the sight of the orange nylon rope on the beam left her in shock. The knotting technique was identical to the one used at the crime scene. She took a photo of the dumpling shop owner with Pak and rushed to show the evidence to the female investigator, urging her to immediately issue a manhunt for the shop owner. However, this single piece of evidence wasn't enough to conclusively prove that the shop owner was the murderer. Lee explained that the owner was Pak's brother, but questioned why their surnames were different. She explained that Pak had borrowed his identity from someone else. Lee concluded that the two brothers had likely committed the crime together, with Pak being the mastermind, manipulating his brother into killing her grandfather. Pak's confession was likely a strategy to buy time for his brother to escape. The clues and reasoning presented by Lee made the female investigator feel that they were highly plausible. They had already captured the faces of the dumpling shop owner and another man on camera. Meanwhile, the attacked police chief had regained consciousness. When the investigator asked him to identify his attacker, the chief pointed his finger at the man with the mustache. He also revealed that the man was none other than the Missing Investigation Division Chief, Dong. This left the female investigator puzzled. She then asked if he had seen the bald man nearby, but the chief replied that he had only seen a doctor enter at that time. This new piece of information caused the investigation to stall once again. The cunning brothers kept everyone on edge. Lee visited Pak again, bringing information about the deceased person whose identity Pak had stolen, as well as the evidence left by the dumpling shop owner. She told Pak that it was only a matter of time before his brother was arrested. She was desperate to know the truth. Although Lee was once again seething with anger, she questioned whether her grandfather, who had raised her, could really be such an irredeemable person. At that moment, the female investigator also informed Lee that Pak's brother was not an accomplice and showed her the faces they had captured. The real perpetrator was the man with the mustache standing nearby. Lee suddenly recalled that she had seen this man, named Dong, when she dined at Pak's brother's dumpling shop. This realization further solidified Lee's suspicions. The two brothers had urged Dong to commit the murders. Pak's true identity was now clear, and Lee only needed to uncover her brother's identity to bring the truth to light. The factory name on Pak's brother's work uniform seemed familiar, as if she had seen it somewhere before. She visited the cemetery alone, where she always noticed the young girl buried beside her grandmother, who was quite conspicuous. The factory name on her clothing matched exactly with the one on Pak's brother's uniform. It seemed intentionally hidden, so out of curiosity, Lee opened the photo frame. It's surprising that this high-rated Korean drama from 2022 didn't become a massive hit. The two men's quest for revenge, executed through highly intelligent crimes, is portrayed brilliantly. The older brother, who owns the dumpling shop, is the mastermind of this entire plot. He has an extremely obedient employee who, after completing all the dirty and tiring work, is satisfied by simply eating a few dumplings. The boss doesn't even pay him for his haircuts, let alone his wages. At night, the boss manipulates this employee into committing murders, forcing them to drown arrogant, corrupt tycoons in water. Meanwhile, the boss films the entire process. Through this brutal method, they end the lives of 3 old men. Their plan to kill the 4th elderly man seemed like it would unfold in the same way, with the same torture and outcome. However, just as they were leaving, a neighbor found the barely alive police chief and rushed him to the hospital, where he miraculously survived. The dumpling shop owner, realizing that things were about to unravel, immediately infiltrates his final target's villa and personally kills the influential old man. His method of execution is identical to that of his employee's previous murders. In an effort to shift the blame onto his employee, the dumpling shop owner sneaks back to the hospital in the dead of night, bringing the bearded man along. He instructs him to silence the surviving police chief. At this point, the bearded man realizes he seems to have lost his memory. The police chief reveals that they had been colleagues in the past, and that Dong was the head of the investigation division. This revelation is too much for the bearded man to handle, especially since the old men he had previously murdered had said the same thing. He begins to suspect that his memory loss is a result of being manipulated by the dumpling shop owner. As the bearded man's thoughts spiral into confusion, the police chief seizes a saltwater bottle and smashes it over his head, knocking him out cold. The chief quickly calls for medical help, but to his surprise, it's the dumpling shop owner who walks in instead of a doctor. Rather than finishing off the chief, the owner administers a sedative and then takes Dong from the hospital, leaving behind both a witness and security footage. The following day, when the investigation team arrives, the police chief insists that the person who attacked him was none other than the long-missing Dong. However, when the doctor enters, the chief's memory becomes foggy, adding another layer of mystery to the already complicated case. The appearance of this unknown figure deepens the confusion for the female investigator. As Dong regains consciousness back at his residence, the dumpling shop owner is there, waiting for him. The owner is ready to reveal everything, starting with the shocking truth about Dong's past. Years ago, when Dong was still ahead of the investigation division, he used torture and abuse to extract confessions, even using high-voltage electricity on his own feet, leaving him with lifelong disabilities. This revelation shocks Dong, who can hardly believe that the same man who once held such power now lives in such a state. The dumpling shop owner explains that after his dismissal due to alcoholism and mental instability, Dong's life spiraled out of control. He was no longer the person he once was. Seeing him in such a pitiable state, the owner took him in and offered him a job at his dumpling shop, effectively saving him from a life of ruin. Dong, refusing to believe the owner's words, stubbornly insists that no one would ever take in their enemy. But the dumpling shop owner, with a smirk, patiently explains everything. It's only then that Dong begins to understand the twisted truth. However, By the time he realizes the full extent of the situation, it's too late to fight back. The owner quickly pulls out a stun gun and knocks him unconscious. When the investigation team arrives, the owner is long gone, vanishing without a trace. On the television, images of Dong committing the murders play repeatedly, solidifying the case against him. The evidence is overwhelming, leaving the female investigator stunned. Meanwhile, Dong is found tied up on the living room sofa in his bedroom, a mere pawn in the owner's elaborate scheme. Through meticulous planning, the dumpling shop owner successfully frames Dong for the murders, making sure all the blame falls on him while eliminating all of his enemies. The final pieces of his revenge puzzle fall into place, leaving the investigation team baffled and the once powerful Dong rendered powerless. Park's sudden confession is a major turning point in the investigation. By taking the blame for all the murders and refusing to reveal any further details about his motives, he effectively throws a wrench into the investigation. His goal is clear. He wants to divert attention away from his brother, Dong, and buy him enough time to escape. Lee's world is shattered as she realizes that the man she loved, Park, is the one who killed her grandfather. His self-serving confession, combined with his refusal to explain why he committed such heinous acts, leaves her with many questions. Why did he do it? Was there something deeper motivating him, or was it just a desire for revenge? As the investigation progresses, Lee becomes even more determined to find the truth behind Park's actions. Her personal feelings toward him are complicated by the fact that he is the man who took the life of the person who had cared for her. Despite his confession, Lee is resolute in her desire to ensure justice for her grandfather, even if it means confronting the man she once loved and ensuring that he faces life in prison for his crimes. Her journey is as much about seeking justice as it is about reconciling her emotional conflict. The owner of the dumpling store is known to be Park's brother. He sneaked into the store and found clues to the crime scene. He found the clues at the scene of the crime and concluded that the two brothers were working together. So, what's the big deal between these two brothers and Grandpa? The photo of the dumpling store gave us a clue. The boss wore the same uniform when he was young. Where has she been before? She came to the cemetery alone, but every time she came to pay her respects, the young girl buried next to her grandmother stood out. The name of the factory on his clothes was exactly the same as the one on Zoo's brother's clothes. And as it seemed to have been purposely placed in the wrong place, she opened the frame with curiosity. The other half of the portrait is of Park's brother, who owns a dumpling store. She wanted to figure out the identity of this woman. She dialed all the numbers she could find from the dumpling shop. Eventually, she managed to contact one of the dumpling shop owner's old colleagues. They had worked together in the same factory back then. The woman in the photo was the dumpling shop owner's fiancée. She was known as a beauty at the time. Just a few days before their wedding, she was violated by the councilman. The bride-to-be chose to take her own life. The dumpling shop owner, however, was arrested and severely tortured. It was at this point that Lee understood. The dumpling shop owner didn't dare to touch the councilman, so he sought revenge through her grandfather. She wanted to figure out the relationship between Park and the woman, so she went to the landlord's house. Although the convenience store's sign was old and worn, the words Duan were still clearly visible. When Lee mentioned the name of the deceased woman to the elderly landlord, her emotions immediately became uncontrollable. Based on her fragmented recollections, Lee concluded that the deceased beauty was the landlord's daughter, who was also Park's sister, so it made sense that Park and his brother-in-law had jointly killed her grandfather. What exactly had her grandfather done to this family? Lee found her grandfather's biological granddaughter, because this woman had once said in front of Lee after the old man's death that he deserved to die. In response to Lee's questioning, her emotions also became uncontrollable, revealing another truth. At the age of 15, Lee's biological grandmother worked as a caregiver for her grandfather and accidentally discovered a hidden secret about him. Just as she was about to leave the villa with the truth, she witnessed her grandfather push Lee's grandmother down the stairs. She was still breathing but was then beaten to death. This truth was enough to cause Lee immense pain. The murderer of her grandmother pretended to be a good person, raised her, and worked tirelessly for his company for many years. Lee felt overwhelmed with guilt. She cried until dawn at her grandmother's grave, determined to seek justice for her. Even if the perpetrator was dead, she was resolute in exposing his crimes. She brought the pile of truths she had gathered and visited Park again. This time, there was no confrontation between them. Lee explained the truth she had uncovered, hoping Pak would tell her what happened back then. With tears in his eyes, he recounted the past. His brother-in-law wanted to seek justice for his sister, but it ended up implicating their whole family. His father was taken to the investigation office and tortured, and Pak had witnessed his father's toes being blackened by the brutal treatment. His mother had suffered a mental breakdown because of it. Pak, left with no other choice, had to follow his brother-in-law in a desperate struggle for survival. Ultimately, it all stemmed from the actions of the officers involved 30 years ago. Back then, the head of the investigation office was the old man who had raised Lee. With all the facts laid bare, the descendants of the two victims were already in tears. This time, Lee was determined to help Pak seek justice. However, what Pak didn't know was that the investigation office had still not found any evidence of his involvement in the crimes. Pak confessed to the female investigator about what had happened back then. If he could, he would have torn those people to pieces. But the reason he studied law was to ensure that the perpetrators received the punishment they deserved. The female investigator also felt deep sympathy for what had happened to Pak's father and the rest of his family. After all, these events were based on true historical occurrences in Korea. There was no longer any reason to continue detaining Pak, and he finally left the investigation office. However, Pak's brother-in-law was not going to let things go easily. He planned to settle the score with the man who had assaulted his fiancée all those years ago. Meanwhile, the politician was busy with his campaign when he suddenly received an unsettling text message. Upon opening it, he saw a video of Pak's brother-in-law killing his father. The video was accompanied by a voiceover detailing the crimes committed by the father and son 30 years ago. The brother-in-law invited the politician to meet with him, warning that if he didn't, he would release the video online. This left the politician, who was in the midst of his election campaign, feeling desperate and forced to confront Pak's brother-in-law face-to-face. The brother-in-law admitted he didn't plan to kill either him or his father, but simply wanted a sincere apology from them. Although these words angered Pak's brother-in-law, he remained calm and composed. He had already hidden a camera on his person to capture the politician's true nature. Just as the politician, in a fit of rage, approached and tried to strangle him, Pak and Lee arrived at the scene. Seizing the opportunity, Pak immediately grabbed the politician and pulled him to the wall. Without hesitation, he fell to the ground, making sure the camera captured the moment the politician pushed him. Pak's brother-in-law became the most devoted character in the story. To avenge his fiancée, he spared no effort in exposing and confronting every wrongdoer.